The Chair lays before the House an enrolled bill.
H.R. 667, an act to redesignate the Dryden Flight Research Center as the Neil A. Armstrong Flight Research Center and the Western Aeronautical Test Range as the Hugh L. Dryden Aeronautical Test Range.
For what purpose does the gentleman from Ohio seek recognition?
Mr. Speaker, I ask unanimous consent that all members may have 5 legislative days to revise and extend their remarks and to include extraneous material on H.R. 2279.
Without objection. Pursuant to House Resolution 455 and Rule 18, the Chair declares the House in the Committee of the Whole House on the State of the Union for the consideration of H.R. 2279. The Chair appoints the gentleman from Kansas, Mr. Yoder, to preside over the Committee of the Whole.
All right, guys.
In the Committee of the Whole House on the State of the Union for the consideration of H.R. 2279, which the clerk will report by title.
A bill to amend the Solid Waste Disposal Act relating to review of regulations under such act and to amend the Comprehensive Environmental Response, Compensation and Liability Act of 1980 relating to financial responsibility for classes of facilities.
Pursuant to the rule, the bill is considered read the first time. The gentleman from Ohio, Mr. Johnson, and the gentleman from New York, Mr. Tonko, each will control 30 minutes. The Chair will now recognize the gentleman from Ohio. House will come to order. Committee will be in order. Chair recognizes the gentleman from Ohio.
Mr. Chairman, I yield myself such time as I may consume.
Gentleman's recognized.
Mr. Chairman, the House is not in order.
Gentleman's correct. The committee will come to order. Gentleman from Ohio is recognized.
Mr. Chairman, I am pleased to rise in support of the amendment to H.R. 2279, the Reducing Excessive Deadline Obligations or REDO Act of 2013, which also includes my legislation, H.R. 2226, the federal and state...
The House is not in order.
Gentleman's correct. The House is still not in order. The House will come to order. Members will take their conversations off the House floor. Committee will come to order. Committee will come to order. Gentleman from Ohio is recognized.
Mr. Chairman, once again, I'm pleased to rise in support of the amendment H.R. 2279, the Reducing Excessive Deadline Obligations or REDO Act of 2013, which also includes my legislation, H.R. 2226, the Federal and State Partnership for Environment Protection Act, and Mr. Lotta's bill, H.R. 2318, the Federal Facility Accountability Act of 2013. Our goal with all 3 of these bills is to modernize some of the environmental laws that we oversee and make sure that the states are playing a significant role in implementing them. To do that, we began this Congress with a hearing on the role of the states in protecting the environment. State environmental protection officials shared their experience and expertise with us, and helped us better understand the complex partnership between the states and the federal government as states implement federal laws such as the Solid Waste Disposal Act, and the EPA implements the Comprehensive Response, Compensation, and Liability Act, or CERCLA or Superfund law, and the relation to state environmental protection laws. Today we consider three bills that are a logical outgrowth of that discussion. The Reducing Excessive Deadline Obligations, or REDO Act of 2013, would give EPA flexibility by correcting two arbitrary action deadlines that were written into the Solid Waste Disposal Act and CERCLA many years ago. RCRA contains a mandate that EPA review and, if necessary, revise all RCRA regulations every 3 years. This deadline is unnecessary and unworkable in the face of the significant number of regulations that currently exist under RCRA. The bill would allow the administrator to review and, if necessary, revise regulations as she thinks appropriate. The bill would also lift an action deadline in CERCLA requiring EPA to identify, prior to 1984, classes of facilities for which to develop financial assurance regulations. Mr. Chairman, the House is not in order.
Gentleman's correct. The committee is not in order. Members, will you please take your conversations off the floor? Gentleman from Ohio is recognized.
More than 30 years passed without action from the EPA to promulgate regulations regarding financial assurance. A lawsuit and court order finally prompted the EPA action just a few years ago. In the meantime, the states and other federal agencies have long since acted, putting in place strong financial assurance requirements of their own. That's why the bill also provides that if EPA does get around to establishing federal financial assurance regulations, the states' requirements would not be preempted. The bill also requires the EPA to gather information regarding the financial assurance programs of states and other federal agencies and report to Congress regarding whether there is a need for additional regulation by the EPA. Should the EPA determine there is a need for additional requirements, the bill ensures that compliance with the existing state or federal requirements will count towards compliance with EPA's requirements. The Federal Facility Accountability Act would bring the CERCLA waiver of sovereign immunity into conformity with the Solid Waste Disposal Act and, for that matter, the Clean Air Act by requiring that all federal Superfund sites comply with the same state laws and regulations as a private entity. Now, this is not a new concept. Legislation has been introduced previously by my friends across the aisle to ensure that federal agencies comply with all federal and state environmental laws, including CERCLA. In fact, the Federal Facilities Compliance Act of 1991 had the same goal, to make federal facilities subject to all the same substantive and procedural requirements, including enforcement requirements and sanctions that state and local governments and private companies meet. The Federal Facility Accountability Act applies this same policy to federal facilities under CERCLA that already applies to federal facilities under the Solid Waste Disposal Act. Some argue that if this bill becomes law, it will change federal agency spending by forcing them to comply with state laws, and that CERCLA is different because it is retroactive and applies to prior actions of the federal government. But the Solid Waste Disposal Act often applies to past conduct. That's why there's a provision for corrective measures. In fact, the EPA has issued multiple guidance documents that describe how federal agencies should harmonize RCRA and CERCLA with respect to cleanups of hazardous waste. Past conduct, future conduct. The fairness principle is the same. The basic question is whether federal agencies should comply with state environmental protection laws just as private companies and state and local agencies must do. My bill, the Federal and State Partnership for Environment Protection Act, does exactly what the title implies and would go a long way toward making the states partners with the EPA in cleaning up hazardous waste sites. CERCLA is implemented by the EPA, but often states are in the best position to understand the sites in their state. This bill would allow states to play a larger role in the CERCLA process in several ways. The bill would allow states to list a site that it believes needs to be on the national priorities list every 5 years and would provide transparency to the states if they suggest a site for listing. The bill would also allow states to be consulted before the EPA selects a remedial action. The states are on the front lines and understand at the ground level how to prioritize environmental actions within their states. They often come up with innovative solutions that better fit the local problem. We heard examples of that in our hearing on the role of the states in protecting the environment. CERCLA is a key example of a statute passed more than 30 years ago that we can now update and strengthen the federal-state partnership to get sites cleaned up. Removing barriers to job creation imposed by federal government is a cornerstone in our governing philosophy. Cory Gardner, Bob Latta, and I produced bills to ensure that the federal government reduces unnecessary red tape, the barriers to job creation, while still keeping our environment healthy. These important bills aim to improve the federal and state relationship when dealing with hazardous waste. With that, Mr. Chairman, I reserve the balance of my time.
The gentleman from Ohio reserves. The gentleman from New York is recognized.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. I yield myself as much time as I consume.
Gentleman's recognized.
Thank you. Mr. Chair, at a time when too many of our citizens are still out of work, our nation's infrastructure is in need of repair, the tax code needs revision, and when the safety net that provides basic necessities for our citizens has a tragic number of holes to close, we are spending our time on yet another bill that is headed straight for the legislative dustbin. It was the high-profile contamination at Love Canal in my home state of New York back in 1978 that motivated Congress to address the serious public health threat that existed at many sites across this country. Toxic contamination of air, of water, and of land from the improper handling and disposal of hazardous materials. Many of us represent districts that have former contaminated sites or sites that still remain to be cleaned up. Superfund is not a perfect law, but it has, in combination with other environmental laws, returned many abandoned, contaminated sites to productive use. When contaminated, blighted land is transformed, the entire community benefits. A long abandoned former industrial site along the riverfront in my district was restored to a popular park. The residents of Amsterdam now enjoy a beautiful waterfront area. H.R. 2279 does nothing to improve public health, or create jobs, or protect the environment, or avoid needless public expenses. In fact, it does the opposite. Title I of this bill further delays actions that should have been taken years ago. Congress included broad authorities for the Environmental Protection Agency to ensure that businesses that handle hazardous substances were financially able to deal with contamination that might result from their activities. This provision remains essential to protecting taxpayer interests, and it ensures these businesses are acting responsibly. EPA's goals within the Superfund program should not stop at cleaning up the legacy sites that we have. It should also prevent new sites from being contaminated. It should prevent more people from being exposed to toxic substances, and it should prevent the property damage, loss of revenue, and stigma that communities experience when they are marred by these sites. H.R. 2279 blocks the Environmental Protection Agency from implementing financial responsibility standards that their Inspector General's Office and the Government Accountability Office have advised are prudent actions that will avoid unnecessary public expenditures to clean up contaminated sites. The GAO's last report on this topic indicated that in the 10-year period they examined, federal agencies spent $2.6 billion to reclaim abandoned hard rock mine sites on federal, state, private, and tribal lands. So how does H.R. 2279 address this potential $100 million per year liability? By blocking EPA from taking recommended steps to avoid these potential cleanup costs. We cannot afford to continue this destructive policy. Under the guise of fiscal responsibility, the majority voted to expand the list of requirements for applicants to the food stamp program to include drug testing, work requirements, in addition to the detailed examination of an applicant's financial assets already required. All this to avoid providing a subsidy of about $1.50 per meal. But apparently it is too much to ask that a business that could expose communities to toxic contamination and leave taxpayers with cleanup costs in the tens of millions of dollars and result in lost local revenue and loss of property values, provide the government with assurance that it can afford to properly manage or clean up contamination that they create. The inconsistency in these policy choices is indeed incredible. Blocking EPA from instituting basic requirements to protect public health, community vitality, local economic interests, and taxpayer interests provides a massive subsidy to a polluter at great public expense. Titles 2 and 3 of this bill are somewhat of a mystery. I have no idea what problems with the Superfund program they propose to fix, but we have heard from the administration about serious problems this bill would indeed create. The proponents of this legislation claim that Title II will provide states more funding, give states a greater role in cleanups, and improve cooperation between states and the federal government on site cleanups. But states already have a significant role. Under current law, states can assert greater control over cleanups through a variety of mechanisms if they wish to do so. The provisions altering the relationship between federal and state government have a number of serious problems. For example, Title III creates situations in which federal employees could find themselves in a legal mess if caught between conflicting state and federal direction of a cleanup site. This is an issue that was raised when this bill was considered by the committee. It was not resolved in committee, and it was not resolved before coming here to the House floor. This is not the first bill this House has considered that demonstrated a disregard for federal workers. This House has repeatedly turned to federal workers to shoulder an unfair amount of the burden of deficit reduction. Our erratic appropriation process has made their jobs more difficult, even as we have reduced their benefits and frozen their salary. We shut down the government, creating tremendous uncertainty for their families and barring people from their workplace. Now we are poised to pass a bill that might result in federal workers being put in jail for doing their job. Mr. Chair, I've touched on a few of the problems with this legislation. This is a poorly crafted bill that offers nothing for the public. It will not speed cleanups. It will not save money. It will not improve public health. This is bad policy and poorly crafted legislation. And with that, I urge my colleagues to reject it. And, Mr. Chair, I reserve the balance of my time.
The gentleman from New York reserves. The gentleman from Ohio is recognized.
Mr. Chairman, I'm proud to yield 3 minutes to my colleague from Ohio, Mr. Lana.
The gentleman is recognized for 3 minutes.
I thank the gentleman for yielding. Mr. Chairman, I rise today in support of H.R. 2279, and specifically a section of the bill I sponsored referred to as the Federal Facility Accountability Act. This common sense legislation updates CERCLA to ensure that federal facilities are held to the same level of accountability as private facilities when it comes to cleaning up the release of hazardous substances. This legislation is supported by a number of state entities that have had numerous problems with federal facilities skirting their CERCLA cleanup responsibilities. As the Department of Environmental Conservation Contaminated Sites Program in Alaska pointed out during one of our subcommittee hearings, a recurring problem is when federal entities use sovereign immunity as a bar to limit or even refute state involvement and oversight of agency cleanups. In these instances, the federal agency is acting as a responsible party, the regulator in which they get to determine which laws to apply and how safe the remedy needs to be, and they also pay the bill. Further, there is inconsistency in how federal agencies apply their CERCLA authority. The Federal Facilities Accountability Act addresses these concerns and existing ambiguity by ensuring current and formerly owned federal facilities will have to comply with the same state requirements as a private entity doing cleanup under CERCLA, and specifically identifies the the types of state procedure and substantive requirements that are applicable to the federal government. Some of the most pressing environmental problems exist at current and former federal facilities, and states have come a long way in developing strong regulatory programs to protect public health, safety, and the environment. It makes sense for federal agencies to comply with these state environmental laws and to clean up contamination at federal facilities to the same standards as everyone else. With strong independent state enforcement authority, the environmental performance of federal agencies will undoubtedly improve. Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and I urge my colleagues to support H.R. 2279, and I yield back.
The gentleman yields back. Gentleman from Ohio reserves. Gentleman from New York is recognized.
Mr. Chair, thank you. I now yield 5 minutes to the distinguished ranker of the Energy and Commerce Committee, former chair of the Energy and Commerce Committee, and a staunch defender in public policy and outspoken word for the environment. And so we ask for 5 minutes for Ranker Waxman.
The gentleman from California is recognized for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and my colleague, Mr. Tonko, for your kind words. I appreciate it. Today, the House is considering legislation to reduce the number of cleanups of dangerous contaminated sites that can occur each year, reducing the number of cleanups, at the same time raising the cost to the taxpayers and letting polluters escape responsibility. This bill is a perfect illustration of what's wrong with the House of Representatives. It's a partisan bill developed through an insufficient committee process that erodes landmark public health protections for the benefit of big polluters. When I first learned that the committee was considering this legislation to address the cleanup of contaminated sites on federal land, I was hopeful that this was an issue that could be pursued on a bipartisan basis. We should always be looking for ways to improve our laws, to be more careful and effective in the use of taxpayers' dollars, and to better protect public health and the environment. But the Energy and Commerce Committee leadership refused to work with the stakeholders to develop a workable and credible proposal. The Department of Justice, the Department of Defense, both offered to come help us craft new and effective policies, but the chairman of the subcommittee refused to even meet with them. Even worse, after the hearing on the bill, where a bill was out there, we had a hearing on it, the House Republicans added provisions that would let private companies avoid accountability for the pollution they cause. That means we're voting on legislation today to create new hurdles for holding polluters accountable, and we have no legislative record to explain it. The outcome of enacting this bill should be obvious. If polluters don't pay to clean up their pollution, then it just becomes one more burden on the taxpayer, and none of us should want that. This is a continuation of a disturbing trend. Over the last 3 years, under Republican control, the House has voted over 400 times to weaken environmental laws. Last year, the House voted 51 times to benefit the oil and gas industry, from gutting laws that fight climate change to repealing rules that cut toxic air pollution. The House Republican leadership appears to have no qualms about targeting any public health and environmental protection. The House Republicans seem to have forgotten. We represent all of the American people. We represent the parents who want to know that their children are not being exposed to cancer-causing pollution. We represent taxpayers who don't want to spend millions to clean up a polluted industrial site simply because a big corporation decided to walk away. And we, yes, even represent the federal employees who shouldn't have to face the threat of state sanctions just for doing their job and following the law as they would under this bill. The administration strongly opposes this bill because it could delay cleanup of contaminated sites with the most urgent human health and safety risks. All of the Democrats on the Energy and Commerce Committee voted against these bills that have been combined and are being presented to us today. We all oppose it because it will increase litigation and let polluters off the hook. This bill would be vetoed if it ever made its way to the President's desk. Most likely, it'll never see the light of day in the other House. This bill might play well with some special interest groups, but it should never become law, and I urge all members to oppose this legislation.
The gentleman from California yields back. The gentleman from New York reserves. The gentleman from Ohio is recognized.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I have to respond, I think, briefly. I appreciate the ranking member's passion in addressing these issues, but we need to clear up what some of the facts actually are. CBO has scored these bills and has come back and said that there are no significant cost increase associated with these. Furthermore, in regards to meeting with the Department of Justice and the Department of Defense, that meeting did occur, and the concerns that they rose were mainly around criminal liabilities for federal employees, and that was addressed in the final legislation. So I'm not sure why we're still debating those issues, but at this time I'd like to yield 2 minutes to my colleague from Colorado, Mr. Gardner.
I thank the gentleman from Ohio.
The gentleman from Colorado is recognized for 2 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, for the recognition, and the gentleman from Ohio for his leadership in managing this legislation today. I also thank the chairman of the subcommittee, Mr. Shimkus of Illinois, for his fine work on this legislation, rising today in support of H.R. 2279, the Reducing Excessive Deadlines Obligation Act, a package of bills, as we have discussed, which includes the Federal Facility Accountability Act by Mr. Latta from Ohio and the Federal and State Partnership for Environmental Protection Act by Mr. Johnson of Ohio. This legislation represents steps to roll back unnecessary and overburdensome regulations that are duplicative and unnecessary. The bills are aimed to protect the state-federal partnership when it comes to cleaning up hazardous waste sites as quickly and as efficiently as possible. The solid waste must be disposed of in a responsible, efficient, and environmentally friendly manner, but there is no need for overly burdensome regulations that put a strain on businesses. While our economy continues to sputter along, common-sense revisions of rules and regulations are a vital and critical component of helping our state and local economies grow. My bill, the REDO Act, does two things. It allows the EPA the authority to revise and review the Resource Conservation and Recovery Act, or RCRA, regulations as appropriate, instead of every 3 years as required under current law. Even the EPA, in written testimony to this committee, to Energy and Commerce Committee, said this regulation, the regulation that we are changing, can pose a significant resource burden on the EPA given the complexity and volume of EPA's RCRA regulations. Again, the EPA has problems with the rule. We're simply trying to change the rule to give them the power to meet the rule. And that's why it's all the more surprising that the President would issue a veto threat over a regulation that his own agency, as written testimony, is saying that they can't comply with it. I have problems with it. This bill also provides that when the EPA promulgates a financial responsibility requirement, existing state or federal requirements are not preempted, and EPA's requirement will fill whatever gap may be left by the requirements set forth by states and other federal agencies. If the EPA does revise requirements, they must submit a report to Congress explaining their justification to do so. It's a common-sense bill, common-sense job legislation, and I urge this Chamber's support. Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
The gentleman's time has expired. The gentleman from Ohio reserves. The gentleman from New York is recognized.
Mr. Chair, I yield an additional 1 minute to the gentleman from California.
The gentleman from California is recognized for 1 minute.
I thank you for yielding so I could correct the record. A bipartisan staff on our committee met with the Department of Justice and the Department of Defense to hear a long list of objections they had to the bill. That was before the markup in committee. When we went into the markup in committee, I personally asked in the public session if Chairman Shimkus, the chairman of the subcommittee, would meet personally with the Department of Justice and Department of Defense because they had great concerns about the bill. He said at that markup that he would. We checked with the Department of Defense, we checked with the Department of Justice, and there has been no such meeting. There has been some change, but they have not really addressed all the issues that I think members should have been taking into consideration. There was really not an attempt, if the gentleman would permit, to work this out on a bipartisan basis, to hear what other people had to say about it. This bill was driven through and being written, whether we had a hearing, written after the hearings, or they had a markup, written after the markup, without getting all the facts, and it's a flawed bill as a result of it. Thank you for yielding to me.
Gentleman's time has expired. Gentleman from New York reserves. Gentleman from Ohio.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I'm proud at this point to yield 3 minutes to my good friend from Pennsylvania, Mr. Meehan.
The gentleman from Pennsylvania is recognized for 3 minutes.
I thank the gentleman from Ohio. Move to strike the last word. Section 106 of this bill requires that the owners and operators of facilities holding certain quantities of materials that are included on the Department of Homeland Security's Chemicals of Interest list report those materials to their state emergency response commissions. And while it's absolutely imperative that state and local authorities are properly informed about potential hazards in their communities, we have to be sure to communicate this information in the most secure, responsible, and effective way. As chairman of the Homeland Security Committee's subcommittee on cybersecurity, infrastructure protection, and security technologies, this provision has concerns for me for two particular reasons. First, the President has already specifically asked several federal agencies, this is the Department of Homeland Security, the Environmental Protection Agency, and AT&F, Alcohol, Tobacco, and Firearms, to assess the feasibility of sharing this kind of information with the emergency response commissions. And so while they're actually engaged in this activity, Section 106 effectively mandates that they share this information immediately, before the President has had a chance to make his determinations, and with sensitive information about the amount, variety, and location of potentially dangerous materials at issue. This directive raises serious security concerns. And second, the DHS Chemicals of Interest list is specific to the Chemical Facilities Anti-Terrorism Standards Program. CFATS has in place a required practice of sharing information in a way that ensures facility security. And I have serious reservations about whether this sensitive information could become compromised or subject to broad dissemination if Section 106 were to become law. Chemical security is the responsibility of the Department of Homeland Security, which is specifically equipped to protect it. And because of these concerns have yet to be addressed, I request that the committee will revisit Section 106 during the conference with the Senate. And with that, I yield to the gentleman from Ohio. And I yield to the gentleman from Illinois, Mr. Shimkus.
I thank my colleague, friend from Pennsylvania, and for calling attention to this concern that you raised. This was in our open deliberative process which we had in the markup. This was added as an amendment to the bill by my friends on the other side. This was prior to the President's rollout of his working group, prior to the President's stated concern about the sensitive nature of this information. And so one of the few times I would agree with the President that this information is very, very sensitive. So it might have been inappropriate at that time to accept this portion of the bill. In our view, protecting this information, especially keeping away from terrorists, is of utmost concern, and I want to assure you that this will be our guiding principle as we consider whether to include Section 106 or any version of it in the final draft of the legislation.
Gentleman's time's expired.
I thank the gentleman, and I yield back to the gentleman from
Gentleman's
Ohio.
time's expired. Gentleman from Ohio reserves. Gentleman from New York.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. I yield 3 minutes to the Chairman Emeritus of the Energy and Commerce Committee and also the longest-serving member of the House, a good friend from the state of Michigan who was at the table in 1980 to oversee Superfund and knows more about the Superfund than perhaps anyone in the House. And so 3 minutes, please, if we could yield to Chairman Emeritus Dingell.
Gentleman from Michigan is recognized for 3 minutes.
I thank my dear friend from New York. I commend him for his outstanding service, and I appreciate his yielding this time to me. Well, we got a bad bill on the floor. Frankly, I'm embarrassed, and if I were one of the Republican managers of this bill, I'd have a red face. Quite honestly, it does nothing except expose federal employees to liability for actually enforcing the law. No oversight was conducted to bring about the consideration of this legislation. No opportunity was made for the agencies to come forward and fully set out their concerns about how this bill is a bad piece of legislation. As the chairman of the Committee on Energy and Commerce, I handled the Superfund amendments and the Reauthorization Acts earlier. In that effort, it was a fully bipartisan undertaking, and we worked very closely with the Reagan administration, which was present and involved in all the conference meetings. The Senate at that time was under Republican control. President Reagan signed the act on October 17, 1986, after overwhelming votes of 386 to 27 in the House and 88 to 8 in the Senate. At one hearing that we had on this bill, I did not hear any support from the majorities of witnesses. Most of them seemed to be somewhat embarrassed about the legislation and were unable to tell us anything that the legislation would accomplish in the public good or towards speeding up or improving the enforcement of Superfund. It was interesting to note that there was really no identification of what the legislation would do to cure the problems that we confront with regard to Superfund. The Superfund program has been a fine example of success after having had a rocky start. And we have seen substantial completion of construction activities at over 70% of the national priority site. Thousands of other short-term actions have also been completed. Before charging headlong into solving problems that are not backed up with a factual record and with no showing whatsoever of a need for the legislation, I recommend that this body first gather the evidence that it needs from EPA, from states, from local governments, from industry and communities to better understand what, if any, problem need to be addressed. Until then, I fail to understand the purpose of this legislation other than a device to provide work for members of the staff to obfuscate the enforcement of Superfund and to, quite frankly, ignore the real problems which exist. Superfund is cursed with the fact that it has major difficulty in being properly funded because the funding for it has long since expired, and now the ability of the nation to fund the cleanup is not available to us. This bill would do nothing to address any of the problems that are there to be seen. It's a bad bill. It should be rejected.
Gentleman's time has expired. Gentleman from New York reserves. Gentleman from Ohio is recognized.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I'm pleased now to yield 5 minutes to my colleague from Illinois, our chairman, Mr. Shimkus.
Gentleman from Illinois is recognized for 5 minutes. Without objection.
Thank you. Well, it's great to be here on the floor with my friends as we talk about moving pieces of legislation. And it's unfortunate that we're no longer a debating society. We're just a statement society, whether we're going back to what's true and right in language of the bill or what's not. Let me talk to folks of how we got to this position. Becoming subcommittee chairman in the last Congress, I talked to my members of my committee and my staff, and I said, there's no perfect piece of legislation, there's no perfect piece of law. What are some things that we can fix to make this process go better? And it wasn't just our ideas. We went to the states who have a huge responsibility, and I think if people watch the body of information of what's coming out of our committee, we've given a lot of deference to the states, and because they're the ones who live closest to these locations. So we bring in the Council of the States, Environmental Council of the States, we're bringing all those stakeholders, and we say, what is it about the federal law that drives you crazy, and if we fixed it, would make your life better? Hence these 3 pieces of legislation that have been rolled into one bill to make it to the floor. Reducing excessive deadline obligations. It allows the EPA to review regulations on solid waste disposal only when necessary. You know what the law says? Regardless if the law works or not, you got to review it every 3 years. And you know what happens when that law is in there? I mean, regardless if it works, regardless if there's no complaint, you got to review it. So that's ripe for litigation. You don't do it within the timeline, whether you need to or not, let's sue and settle. Let's do something. So that's why all we're saying is, if the law works, if the regulations are good, if there's no complaints, don't have an automatic timeline of having to renew it in 3 years. The state said, yeah, we'd like that because we're spending more time. Part of the problem with the Superfund is Huge amounts of money go to litigation. Surprise, surprise. We want to get money away from litigation to remediation. That's all we're trying to do. The bill also requires EPA, prior to developing new financial responsibility requirements. That's the key. What's a financial responsibility requirement? What do you have to have available if you're going to do this site in case something goes wrong, you need cleanup? What are the financial requirements? What's the bonding you need? All we're saying is don't change the rules. And if you're going to change the rules for financial bonding while the process and the site is being operated, wouldn't it be good to talk to the states and let people know that the federal government's going to change the rules in the operation of a new site? States said, good idea, you ought to look at that. One other part of the bill is the Federal and State Partnership Environmental Protection Act of 2013, which requires the EPA to consult with states when undergoing a removal action. So usually what happens, a Superfund site, federal government gets involved, they're going to help do the majority of the cleanup. But guess who has the long-term observation and administration costs of the site? The states do. All we're saying is, if we're going to start to remediate in a state, let's have the states sit down and work with the EPA so the state knows its long-term cost. Pretty simple. And the last one, which I always find pretty amazing that my friends on the other side are arguing about, protecting the federal government to pollute. All we're saying is, when the federal government's polluted a site, the federal government ought to clean it up. We make everyone else do it. We hold everyone else responsible. But no, if the federal government's polluted, we give them immunity, sovereign immunity. They don't have to do anything. So this law says it's about time that the federal government comply with the same laws that states do and other individuals do. This is a position my colleagues have had for many, many years. And of all the portions of this bill that I thought that they would be all for, is moving this position that the federal government should comply with the same laws as everyone else does. And for my colleagues on the other side to protect governmental polluters, I just find unbelievable. So the process was good. We had hearings. We had markups. We had amendments agreed to. I'm proud of my colleagues in bringing these bills to the floor. I'm glad of the participation by the states, and I look forward to the moving of the bill, and I yield back the balance of my time.
Gentleman's time's expired. Gentleman from Ohio reserves. The gentleman from New York is recognized.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. I will yield, but before so doing, I would like to make a few comments. I keep hearing from the bill's supporters that the states need and want this legislation. I'm a little confused by those statements. My staff called the Association of State and Territorial Solid Waste Management Officials, and they do not support the legislation. We also called the Environmental Council of the states, which represents the state environmental commissioners, and they have not endorsed the instant legislation before the House. So I'm somewhat confused by the statements being made here. I would ask, Mr. Chair, if we could please yield to the gentleman from New Jersey, Mr. Pallone, who has fought for many environmental causes through the committee on behalf of his home state of New Jersey, and for that matter for this nation. So we yield 3 minutes to the gentleman from New Jersey.
The gentleman from New Jersey is recognized for 3 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I want to thank my colleague from New York, the ranking member of the subcommittee. Mr. Chairman, I rise today to urge my colleagues to vote no on H.R. 2279. This is an unnecessary and ill-advised piece of legislation. It would significantly weaken our country's hazardous waste laws and further shift the burden of cleaning up these sites from the entities responsible for the contamination to the taxpayer instead. Mr. Chairman, polluters are already not paying their fair share to help clean up America's worst toxic sites, and this bill only makes things worse. Since 1995, when the Superfund taxes expired, taxpayers have shouldered an unreasonable responsibility to pay for these cleanups. I have a bill, the Superfund Polluter Pays Act, which would reauthorize the original Superfund fees and make polluters, not taxpayers, pay the cost of cleaning up Superfund sites. Congress needs to reinstate the polluter pays taxes so the industries most responsible for polluting our land and water are held responsible for cleaning up our toxic legacy, a legacy that severely affects my home state of New Jersey. But again, we face the prospect of the Republican majority dismantling our nation's critical environmental laws. The bill before us today is really a combination of 3 bills, all of which will hinder hazardous cleanup across the country. And I'm especially troubled by provisions in the bill that enable states to veto sites from being added to the Superfund National Priority List, as well as a provision that weakens the requirement for companies who deal with hazardous materials to carry insurance to cover contamination threats. Absent this insurance requirement, it will be easier for a company to go bankrupt and shirk its responsibility to clean up contamination that it has caused. So, Mr. Chairman, cleaning up Superfund sites creates jobs by converting the contaminated areas into productive land ready for redevelopment and employing engineers, construction workers, and others engaged in the cleanup. I've seen this in my home state. New Jersey has more Superfund sites than any other state, and my county of Middlesex actually has more sites than any other county. But we've cleaned up a lot of these sites and created jobs, and they're now used for recreation, for manufacturing, for shopping centers, so many other things. We don't want to weaken the Superfund law. That would be a huge mistake. So I urge all of my colleagues to vote no on this legislation, and I yield back.
Gentleman yields back. The gentleman from New York reserves. Gentleman from Ohio is recognized.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Just a couple of quick points of clarification. My friend and colleague, Mr. Tonko, and I, we agree on many things, and we've got a history of having worked together to hold the EPA to common sense rules, and I appreciate that. But I need to clarify just a couple of quick things that my colleague mentioned. From the Environmental Council of States, I have here before me a letter that I'd like to enter into the record, Mr. Chairman, stating that the Environmental Council of States is writing to support many of the concepts included in this legislation on all 3 pieces of this legislation. And the other organization, the Association of State and Territorial Solid Waste Management officials, they don't take positions on legislation. So no matter what the piece of legislation would be, if you call them, they're not going to take a position on it one way or another. That doesn't mean that they do not support this. They simply don't take positions. So I wanted to make those clarifications for the record, and without objection, I'd like to enter this letter into the record.
The request will be covered by general leave.
I'm sorry?
The request is covered by general leave.
With that, I reserve the balance of my time.
Gentleman reserves. The gentleman from New York is recognized.
Yes, we're going to yield to the gentleman from Oregon, but before so doing, while the Environmental Council of the States may have supported some concepts of the bill, they have not moved to endorse the bill, and that I'll stand by my statement. Next, a staunch defender of the environment and a good friend from the state of Oregon, the gentleman from Oregon, Mr. Blumenauer, is going to address us next, and we'll yield 3 minutes to the gentleman from Oregon.
Oregon is recognized for 3 minutes.
Thank you. I appreciate the gentleman's courtesy and leadership here on the floor. When I first heard that we were going to be dealing with the Superfund and reforms and modifications, I was originally encouraged. I've been working with these issues in the federal level and before that for over almost 20 years as a local official dealing with the problems of pollution and Superfund sites. I know that there are many challenges to the process, that it is chronically and dramatically underfunded, it's complex, it's cumbersome. Many of the participants are not fully equipped to be able to manage it. And we've learned a little bit in the almost 30 years since the legislation was passed. But I'm sad to say, sadly disappointed. Because rather than dealing in a thoughtful, bipartisan way to try and refine the process, we're actually taking a step backward. This would water down the requirements and provide fewer dollars, blurring lines of responsibility. This is not going to help. The Superfund tax expired in 1995. And since then, we've been shifting this burden away from the petrochemical industry that created these problems in the main, shifting it to the general fund taxpayer and a scarce and dwindling supply. This isn't going to move away from litigation. It's going to make it more likely, if it were enacted. Confusing people, changing the rules that people have operated under is not going to be helpful. It's going to slow it down further. I am deeply concerned that the Department of Defense has not fully met its obligation as the largest generator of Superfund sites in the United States. I've been on this floor repeatedly attempting to work through the budget process and the authorization process for us to step up and do right by people. I've got a harbor that was a staging area for 3 wars, and a significant amount of the pollution there that we're dealing with is a result of that Defense Department operation. But what we're doing here would, according to the Department of Defense, disrupt the national priority scheme in which the most contaminated federal sites are cleaned up first, that it would increase litigation, delay cleanups, and waste already limited resources. Now, by pretending that somehow the state government is going to take the lead and compel federal agencies to do things that may in fact be contrary to federal law, is not going to speed this process further. It's not going to make it easier. It's going to continue what is the problem. People today dig in their heels. We haven't actually moved forward to try and work carefully in a... May I have 30 additional seconds?
We'll yield the gentleman from Oregon an additional 1 minute.
Gentleman's recognized for an additional minute.
To thoughtfully, in a bipartisan session, refine it, we're going ahead and trying to superimpose on top of it things that will undercut that effort. Now, I am critical of what the federal government has done in some areas. But as a practical matter, local governments, when a failure to zone, plan, regulate, and exercise oversight, have often been responsible for many of these problems. And they have, in the main, not stepped up and been aggressive with the strictest of standards. And this would superimpose what are potentially less rigorous or, in fact, no local standards, be able to cost shift to the federal government without any interest in providing the resources for the federal government to do so. I would hope that our friends, if they're sincere, would spend time with people who are in the trenches and look for ways on a bipartisan, thoughtful way to refine the Superfund program so that in the spirit of what originally created the legislation, we can do something that will do better by our constituents, better by the environment, and better by the taxpayer.
The gentleman's time has expired. Gentleman from New York reserves. Gentleman from Ohio is recognized.
Mr. Chairman, may I inquire as to how much time I have remaining?
The gentleman from Ohio has 10 minutes remaining, and the gentleman from New York has 7 3/4 minutes remaining.
Mr. Chairman, I continue to reserve the balance.
The gentleman from Ohio continues to reserve. The gentleman from New York is recognized.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. We'll yield 3 minutes to the gentleman from Minnesota, Mr. Ellison, who has organized the environmental justice advocates of his home state of Minnesota, and also the chair of the Progressive Caucus in the House. So we yield 3 minutes to the gentleman from Minnesota.
Gentleman from Minnesota is recognized for 3 minutes.
Mr. Speaker, the polluter pays. The polluter pays, and that's a simple idea with very broad appeal. The company responsible for causing the pollution should have to pay for the cleanup. Makes sense? This bill would relieve many companies of that responsibility when it comes to the most polluted sites in the country. Instead, taxpayers would pick up the tab. It's another bailout. Currently, if a company is part of an industry with a record of pollution, it needs to post a bond or buy insurance. This requirement helps to prevent a company from polluting until it goes out of business, leaving the taxpayer with the bill for the cleanup. H.R. 2279 allows the company to skirt its financial responsibility, in essence, to internalize all the money they make while they're polluting, but to externalize all the cost after they're done and leaving everyone else to shoulder the burden. That's not free market enterprise. That's crony capitalism. The bill would also reduce funding for these highly contaminated sites. It should be increasing funding for these sites so that their cleanup does not drag on for decades. Less funding is not the answer. Because funding is already so short, these Superfund sites, we have to prioritize the worst sites for cleanup. And the result is the National Priorities List. This bill would disrupt that priority system. So, Mr. Speaker, instead of letting polluters off the hook, we should use the money to put people to work by cleaning up the long list of toxic sites all over the country that are exposing people to toxic waste, pushing down property values, and inhibiting economic growth. And as I close, I just want to say this bill, like so many bills offered by the majority, rests upon a falsehood. And that is that health and safety regulations hurt the economy. They don't. It's not true. It is a false statement, and there's no evidence for them to prove that it is true, and yet they want us to believe that as these companies deregulate and get tax cuts and all these other bennies, that they're going to use the extra money they get in order to create jobs, which they never do. Reject this bill. It's a bad idea.
The gentleman from Minnesota yields back. The gentleman from Ohio is recognized.
Mr. Chairman, I continue to reserve the balance of my time.
The gentleman from Ohio reserves. The gentleman from New York is recognized.
Mr. Chair, I have no further speakers, and I'm prepared to close.
The gentleman is recognized.
Mr. Chair, H.R. 2279 is a deeply flawed bill that will increase costs, increase litigation, slow down the pace of cleanups, and indeed put the public at risk. It will do nothing to make cleanups at contaminated sites more efficient or more effective. The proponents' intended goals for this legislation are not reflected in the bill's language. We can and we should do much better for people living in communities that are dealing with toxic legacies from past failures to deal with hazardous substances properly. If we want to prevent new Superfund sites from being created and to clean up contaminated sites in their communities and convert them from liabilities to productive assets, we must reject H.R. 2279. I oppose this legislation and urge my colleagues to do the same. And with that, Mr. Chair, I yield back the balance of my time.
The gentleman from New York yields back his balance of time. The gentleman from Ohio is recognized to close.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. In closing, I want to go back and revisit just briefly some of the cost implications or the allegations of cost implications of today's legislation that we're considering. CBO carefully analyzed all three of the bills that we're considering as part of H.R. 2279 today, and here's what they said. CBO estimates that in some cases, implementing this legislation could affect the pace of discretionary spending if priorities for cleanup activities change. However, CBO expects that total cost to fulfill federal responsibilities under CERCLA would be little changed under this legislation. This is directly from the CBO score for H.R. 2226. Based on information from the EPA, CBO expects that removing the current requirement to review certain regulations every 3 years would reduce administrative costs. However, some of these savings in administrative expenses would be offset by spending on the new requirement to report to Congress any financial responsibility requirements. CBO estimates that, on balance, implementing this legislation would not have a significant net impact on spending that is subject to appropriation over the 2014-2018 period. Enacting H.R. 2279 would not affect direct spending or revenues. This is directly from the CBO score for H.R. 2279. CBO estimates that enacting this legislation could increase the pace of discretionary spending to the extent that federal agencies accelerate spending related to cleanup activities or pay additional fines and penalties imposed by the states. However, CBO expects that aggregate long-term costs to fulfill federal responsibilities under CERCLA would be little changed under the legislation. In addition, H.R. 2318 would increase direct spending to the extent that fines and penalties were paid from the Treasury's Judgment Fund. However, CBO expects that any incremental spending from that fund would probably be insignificant. CBO estimates that any additional direct spending over the 2014-2023 period would be insignificant. CBO goes on to say, enacting this legislation would not fundamentally change the federal government's responsibility to comply with CERCLA. According to the latest financial report of the United States, the federal government's current environmental remediation and waste disposal liabilities exceed $300 billion under all environmental laws. Under current law, federal agencies, in particular the Departments of Defense and Energy, currently spend billions of dollars each year conducting cleanup activities under CERCLA, including reimbursements to state agencies for related services they provide. Based on information from federal agencies and industry representatives, CBO expects that enacting this legislation could induce federal agencies to accelerate their compliance activities at some facilities, possibly changing the timing of funding requests for certain projects. As a result, H.R. 2318 might lead to greater compliance costs for federal facilities for the years immediately following enactment, but the long-term cost of compliance would not change substantially. And so I just wanted to make that point for the record. And finally, in closing, I want to urge my colleagues not to be misled by my colleagues' argument that this bill somehow prevents the EPA from enacting financial assurance requirements. It simply does not. More than 30 years passed before EPA complied with the requirements of CERCLA and started the process of developing financial assurance requirements. All this bill does is require the EPA to acknowledge the body of law developed by the states and other federal agencies in the more than 30 years since the EPA has failed to act. This legislation does not limit EPA from establishing federal CERCLA financial responsibility requirements or from setting a minimum level of financial assurance that is required. H.R. 2279 merely ensures that existing state and federal requirements can be used to meet those requirements where appropriate, and ensures that existing state protections that may already exceed a new federal minimum requirement will not be automatically voided. The purpose of the provision in the bill requiring the EPA to report to Congress before new CERCLA financial responsibility requirements are enacted is to make sure that there is a legitimate need for new requirements. It does not prevent the EPA from promulgating new requirements if they are necessary. My colleague argues that the bill is based on the false premise that states are implementing adequate financial assurance requirements. The bill does not prejudge state financial assurance requirements. What the bill does is require the EPA to analyze the existing financial assurance requirements, and it directs the EPA to fill the gap left by financial assurance regulations developed by the states or other federal agencies. But make no mistake, if there is a regulatory gap and that the EPA believes that gap needs to be filled, the EPA is free to enact regulations. The purpose of financial assurance under 108B of CERCLA was to prevent the creation of new Superfund sites. The bill provides a mechanism for gathering information to decide whether the existing state and federal financial assurance requirements are adequate to protect the federal government from incurring response costs under CERCLA. The bill directs the EPA to gather information and report back to us before it promulgates any additional requirements. It does not otherwise preclude the EPA from enacting rules if the EPA determines it's necessary. And in fact, we understand that the EPA has already been gathering this information from the states and other federal agencies like the Bureau of Land Management and the Forest Service. The bill simply sets out a process for us to learn what state and other agency requirements are out there and whether there's a need for more regulation before the EPA creates yet another layer of regulation. Contrary to what my colleagues are saying, the bill does not cut off any rulemaking by the EPA. And with that, Mr. Chairman, I yield back the balance of my time.
The gentleman from Ohio yields back the balance of his time. All time for general debate has now expired. Pursuant to the rule, the bill shall be considered for amendment under the 5-minute rule. in lieu of the amendment in the nature of a substitute recommended by the Committee on Energy and Commerce, printed in the bill.